with the rumble so low as to be inaudible, growing, throbbing, then fuming into a thundering roar. The earthquake starts. Only it's not like any earthquake in recorded history. In California, the mountains shake like ferns in a breeze. The mighty Pacific rears back and piles up into a mountain of water more than 2 miles high, then starts its race eastward. With the force of 1,000 armies, the wind attacks, ripping, shredding everything in its supersonic bombardment. The unbelievable mountain of Pacific seawater follows the wind eastward, burying Los Angeles and San Francisco as if they were but grains of sand. Nothing, but nothing stops the relentless, overwhelming onslaught of wind and ocean. Across the continent, the 1,000-mile-per-hour wind wreaks its unholy vengeance. Everywhere, mercilessly, unceasingly, every living thing is ripped to shreds while being blown across the countryside, and the earthquake leaves no place untouched. In many places, the Earth's molten sublayer breaks through and spreads a sea of white-hot liquid fire to add to the Holocaust. Within 3 hours, the fantastic wall of water moves across the continent, burying the wind-ravaged land under 2 miles of seething water coast to coast. In a fraction of a day, all vestiges of civilization are gone. The great cities of Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, Dallas, New York are nothing but legends. Barely a stone is left where millions walked just a few hours before. A few lucky ones who managed to find shelter from the screaming wind on the lee side of Pikes Peak watch the sea of molten fire break through the quaking valleys below. The raging waters follow, piling higher and higher, steaming over the molten earth fire and rising almost to their feet. Only at great mountains such as this can one withstand the cataclysmic onslaught. North America is not alone in her death throes. Central America suffers the same cannonade, wind, earth fire, and inundation. South America finds the Andes not high enough to stop the cataclysmic violence pounded out by nature in her berserk rage. In less than a day, Ecuador, Peru, and western Brazil are shaken madly by the devastating earthquake, burned by molten earth fire, buried under cubic miles of torrential Pacific seas, and then turned into a frozen hell. Everything freezes. Man, beast, plant, and mud are all rock hard in less than 4 hours. Europe cannot escape the onslaught. The raging Atlantic piles higher and higher upon itself, following the screeching wind eastward. The Alps, Pyrenees, Urals, and Scandinavian mountains are shaken and heaved even higher before the wall of water strikes. Western Africa and the sands of the Sahara vanish in nature's wrath under savage attack by wind and ocean. The area bounded by the Congo, South Africa, and Kenya suffers only severe earthquakes and wind, no inundation. Survivors there marvel at the sun standing still in the sky for nearly half a day. Eastern Siberia and the Orient suffer a strange fate indeed, as though a giant subterranean scythe swept away the Earth's foundations, accompanied by the wind in its screaming symphony of supersonic death and destruction. As the Arctic basin leaves its polar home, Eastern Siberia, Manchuria, China, and Burma are subjected to the same annihilation as South America: wind, earth fire, inundation, and freezing. Jungle animals are shredded to ribbons by the wind, piled into mountains of flesh and bone, and buried under avalanches of seawater and mud. Then comes the terrible paralyzing cold. Not man, nor beast, nor plant, nor earth is left unfrozen in the entire eastern Asian continent, most of which remains below sea level. East of the Urals, in western Siberia, a few lucky people survive the fantastic winds and quakes. Antarctica and Greenland, with their ice caps now rotating around the Earth in the torrid zone, a fury of wind and inundation marches on for 6 days and nights. During the 6th day, the oceans start to settle in their new homes, running off the higher grounds. On the 7th day, the horrendous rampage is over. The Arctic Ice Age is ended, and a new Stone Age begins. The oceans, the great homogenizers, have laid down another deep layer of mud over the existing strata in the Great Plains, as exposed in the Grand Canyon, Painted Desert, and Badlands. The Bay of Bengal Basin, just east of Indonesia, is now at the North Pole. The Pacific Ocean, just west of Peru, is the South Pole. Greenland and Antarctica, now rotating equatorially in the torrid zone, find their ice caps dissolving madly in the tropical heat. Massive walls of water and ice surge towards the ocean, taking everything from mountains to plains in gushing, heaving paths, creating immense seasonal moraines, and in less than 25 years the ice caps are gone, and the oceans around the world rise over 200 feet with the newfound water. The torrid zone will be shrouded in a fog for generations from the enormous amounts of moisture poured into the atmosphere by the melting ice caps. The new ice caps begin to form in new polar areas. Greenland and Antarctica emerge with verdant tropical foliage. Australia is the new, unexplored continent in the North Temperate Zone, with only a few handful of survivors populating its vastness. New York lies at the bottom of the Atlantic, shattered, melted by earth fire, and covered by unbelievable amounts of mud. Of San Francisco and Los Angeles, not a trace is left. Egypt emerges from its Mediterranean inundation new and higher. Still the land of ages, the commonplace of our time becomes the mysterious Baalbek of a new era. A new era. Yes, the cataclysm has done its work well. The greatest population regulator of all does once more for man what he refuses to do for himself, and drives the pitiful few who survive into a new Stone Age. Once more the Earth has shifted its 60-mile thick shell, with the poles moving almost to the equator in a fraction of a day. Again, the atmosphere and oceans, refusing to change direction with the Earth's shell, have wiped out almost all life. After this tumble, we'll join Noah, Adam and Eve, Atlantis, Mu, and Olympus, and Jesus joins Osiris, Zeus, and Vishnu. So, what did we just read, and why are we hearing about it on this channel? Seems very odd and sensational. But to understand this recently declassified version of Earth's cyclical catastrophism, let's begin with the most well-known version of it. Professor Charles Hapgood promulgated the Earth's crust displacement theory in 1958. That work was supported by Einstein, for which he wrote a foreword. In Hapgood's version, the Earth's polar wander accelerated from the normal 1 degree every million years to taking a 40-degree tilt every 5,000 years or so. This ended up being part of the reason it was not accepted. The science from the rock of Earth has told a very different story. The book classified 8 years after Hapgood's, called The Adam and Eve Story, you heard Chapter 1 to begin this video, is indeed describing a similar one-day shift of the geographic poles due to the destabilization of the asthenosphere boundary of mantle and crust by magnetic reversal or destabilization behavior of the core of Earth, which could reduce the friction of the mantle and allow that low-velocity zone to become a free fluid flowing zone. In the classified 1966 version, the polar ice caps drag themselves to the equator. This is similar to the publicized work of Hapgood in 1958, with the exception of it being a full 90-degree tilt in the classified work that doesn't go randomly each cycle, but which tilts, then tilts right back in the next cycle. Hapgood did not have that in his model. Their explanation is intriguing, and again, so is Velikovsky's of planetary orbital changes, just as the more recent work of David Talbot and the older works of Sitchin. Each is trying to explain the cyclical catastrophe that used to be so well understood that its existence was not what consumed their questions, but why did it keep happening? Even Einstein did get caught up in the mix, but had to rely on Hapgood's and others' knowledge of geology and mineralogy. One can find many references to these names, and ones like Hugh Brown, who said the ice caps were the culprit back in 1948, and the earliest recognized mentions of the cyclical catastrophe, they say, are the 1870s. That is, of course, unless you go by the work of the classified report, which extends the timeline nearly 100 years back to 1779. So one is forced to ask, why was this one classified? The concept of cyclical catastrophe was not new. The ties to myth and religion were made by Velikovsky and others. The ice cap drag being the physical manifestation was true in Brown and Hapgood's works, so what's the difference? It was the 90-degree flip back and forth each cycle. That is the key difference. But is that a reason for classification? Well, it is true that not creating panic in the public has been and continues to be a reason for secrecy and classification, and to create panic, something like this would have to be proven scientifically. Now hold that thought. So maybe you didn't know this about Professor Hapgood. He worked for the CIA immediately before becoming a professor and leading into this catastrophism thing. He in fact worked for them as Brown proffered the catastrophe idea in the 40s. So why is it so important that we focus on the timeline and severity and patterned motion back and forth to the same places within the declassified document? It became almost immediately clear upon thorough review that Hapgood's version wouldn't work. Even Einstein ended up telling him so years later, arguing that ice cap weight alone would not be enough. There had to be something more. But the real damning evidence was coming in the form of time averaged pole position over millions of years. The rock was showing them evidence of polar wander being much slower, with their locations not having changed much in millions of years, essentially throwing out the concept that every 5 or 6,000 years there was a random 40-degree tilt. That is what utterly destroyed Hapgood's hypothesis, but it does not destroy the ping-pong back and forth hypothesis, especially because over millions of years there will be evidence of the pole in nearly that same position over major amounts of time. Unfortunately, the scientists didn't know about the classified work, so it was not something they ever looked for. In terms of time averaged pole position, think about this. The poles could flip back and forth one day every year, and over millions of years, you would have evidence of the pole in that exact same position, and might be tricked into thinking it has never moved at all. This was the case in 1985 when a highly cited article was published by a master's student at Columbia University, saying the poles were only averaging 1 degree movement per million years. Columbia, by the way, is where CIA recruitment has been strongest and runs deep at the Ivy League, where the CIA funneled money through the National Science Foundation, and yes, that movie, 2012, depicting the rapid pole shift in a day, was about the classified work's timeline and severity, not Hapgood's as was said in the movie, but what can you expect from Columbia Pictures? Now, Columbia is a whole weird story, but let's get back to the science, because this was also the case with notable works using the same time-averaged flaws up through history to now. One of the nails in the coffin came in 2002, in the work now cited over 500 times and looked to as the death of Earth's crust displacement theory. Except the correction has only been cited about 50 times, and in terms of the latitude and longitude positions of the poles, the correction has some of these values changing so wildly from the initial publication as to include the opposite side of the world, the highest possible error in this type of analysis. All work crushing the theory utilizes these flawed studies, especially the long-term averaged pole position, and none address the problem of a ping-pong shift where you would have that time averaged pole position appearing to be in the same area over millions of years. Much of our understanding is based on assumptions, and the further into the past and deeper into the rock we go, the less well tested those assumptions are. As it was so eloquently put in the classified work, many attempts have been made to answer the charge made to the geological profession to explain these sudden revolutions. Every time the cataclysmic concept has come to life, the beast has been stoned, burned at the stake, beaten to a pulp, and buried with a vengeance, but the corpse simply won't stay dead. Each time, it raises the lid of its coffin and says in its sepulchral tones, "You will die before I." Truly, the entirety of the absence of this reality from our modern lexicon is function of good science debunking a slightly misguided version of an idea. That's not to say the classified version we are beginning to share here is verified. It's simply not the Earth's crust displacement theory you find online. It has never been tested or debunked, and none of the studies showing long-term average motion can account for these types of shifts back to the same places time after time. What a coincidence that the one theory that could break these debunkings was the one that got classified. What you actually saw in the movie 2012 was what the CIA classified among all the things that could have been classified during that time that are seemingly so similar, but for that specific pattern in the cycle. This was a well-accepted aspect of ancient civilization, and it is very hard for my scientific preferences to look at the corroborating stories with the characters and events so similar from China and India to the Americas and believe that they made it all up. Wouldn't such a thing consume the people if widely proven to be coming again someday? Perhaps even cause panic. Where is one's incentive to go audit people's taxes or show up and take names at the doctor's office or take orders at your job at McDonald's or Wendy's? Can you truly have a fully functioning and hard-working populace that is enlightened and illuminated to these realities? Now, while I'd like to declare it sounds idealistically great to say yes, I'll admit to questioning its practicality and realism just based on knowing the current state of the human race. If the cycle was due up again in 100 years, what would you change about your life? About what you told your children? What if it was 20 years away? Or 2? Let's take a look at some interesting facts. The classified work mentions Pikes Peak and similar massive mountains as being the only places one could survive this event. It is noteworthy that Pikes Peak is right next to Cheyenne Mountain, the famous NORAD facility that can be found deep within the mountain. It's widely believed that from New Mexico up past the secret tunnels beneath Denver Airport and up into Wyoming, there are bases and tunnels and many manner of government activity. By the way, Cheyenne Mountain was built 1961 to 1966 in the wake of Hapgood's work and during the release of the now declassified work. The next pole positions stated in that declassified work are the Bay of Bengal and just off the coast of Peru. This is astonishingly similar to the movement of the actual magnetic poles at the moment, set to meet in the Indian Ocean with the Americas on the opposite side of the world. Back in the 60s, there was no indication from the North Magnetic Pole movement that it was aiming for that region. That did not become clear until the motion acceleration from the 70s through the start of this millennium. So where did it come from? Again, the past histories telling the tale and observational evidence today suggest those magnetic components are on their way there now. This document is clearly missing pages, like page 8 for example, nowhere to be found. This lets us know that even in declassification there were things they wouldn't share. One cannot even be certain that Photoshop wasn't used to reconstruct the document, especially since this sanitized version has 0 blackout lines. We are not supposed to know exactly where things are missing. This might be why it's hard to get behind everything in the classified work. There's stuff missing. For example, in what we do have, they do not prove the magnetic aspect of the causation, although I must admit it works mechanistically. It matches my estimate from a few years ago on where the new magnetic poles are heading, and we're indeed seeing the magnetic disruption well underway already. I much more question the rotation and tilt dynamics as described, and I will admit possibly it's because so much of the information is missing, but more from a lack of explanation perspective, leaving us with only that vague description of the tilt. I would love a bit more. I strongly question the artificial satellite he claims an ancient civilization sent up to track for timing purposes of the catastrophe. There has definitely been no physical evidence of that beyond a couple stories which do seem to suggest it, but of course, there's some technological deficiency problems with our ancestors there, unless, as is stated in the declassified work, they were indeed advanced in previous cycles and were returned to the Stone Age later. Lots of questions, no great answers. But something we do know is the reason for the work of these great scientists, the same reason the stories pervade every ancient culture, in the bones of the fauna, the positions of the rock, all saying that sudden revolutions of Earth's surface was to blame for a cataclysm, with evidence corroborating on every continent of tens of millions of animals dying seemingly at once, as if twisted and torn by a cosmic rage. Noah's and the Sumerian flood was a few thousand years ago. There is rock evidence and Genesis 1, which the classified book convincingly argues is a description of post-cycle Earth, pointing to 11,500 years ago. And taking it back one more cycle to 17,000 years ago, brings to mind Göbekli Tepe, along with being buried under unthinkable amounts of sand. Vishnu shares the resurrection of man through the cataclysm in a story of 10 cycles ago. He is their god of resurrection from the water. Osiris as well, in Egypt, played that role, and the Ragnarok tale of the serpent who held back the sea and the fire demons from below, pointing to Zeus, with Kronos, Odin, Saturn being a major factor in previous cycles. Now this seems to suggest to me some odd blend of the classified Chan work and also the work of Velikovsky and Talbot, but with more order to the cycles than the chaos portrayed by Velikovsky. The poles still have to get back to this position where they look like they're in the same place over millions of years. You can find buttercup flowers flash frozen fresh in the mouths and bellies of mammoths. The sudden collapses of civilizations like in Peru 11,500 years ago are all too common. There is Alp granite lifted 4,000 feet up the Jura mountain range. Our ancestors allegedly cut megalithic rocks and then took them miles and miles up the mountain from where they were quarried. The Piri-Reis map and Egyptian water clock have incredible agreement. The stories of the long night, the day the sun stood still, the day the sun rose in the west, and the day it set in the wrong direction. There's jade in the Orient, which must have been thrust up from deep within the mantle, potentially at a pivot point of the displacement tilt. And there are homogeneous stratigraphy zones in the US showing rapid deposition of massive amounts of mud. We also have the claimed pole positions from the now declassified book over the last 35,000 years showing the ping-pong back and forth. Indeed, over millions of years you wouldn't see much movement in the average pole position at all. There is certainly enough evidence to resurrect this beast once more. I am hoping to have shown here that the debunking of the entire idea of Earth's crust displacement is based on a version of that idea that is critically different from the one that got classified. That one has never been tested, and it is actually supported by the repeated position of the pole over millions of years, not debunked by it. Something I find incredibly interesting is the fact that we can almost certainly track this happening if it's real and going to happen again. Whether or not it's a magnetic destabilization as the classified work suggests, the flip described would have to be the separation of crust and mantle, because otherwise the stories of Earth fire would not exist in these contexts, and they are ubiquitously found within them. The region we're talking about of Earth is the low velocity zone, so called because of its high conductivity, low relative motion, and where the boundary acts to provide friction, potentially stopping the poles from pulling themselves down to the equator. This is where we already look to indicate further seismic activity of the crust. This is what QuakeWatch.net was built for. And so by watching for anomalous activity at that very same low velocity zone over periods of time, we may have an excellent way to gauge a timeline. If we were to start getting magnitude 7 earthquakes every day at the low velocity zone all around the world, it might be interesting to see if the GPS problems ramp up and if space weather has a greater magnetospheric effect. All things we can now track in nearly real time. This has just been the tip of the iceberg. There is more coming, including on the cyclical catastrophes and the evidence for them. The evidence for it being a combination of the stories we've heard thus far. We'll be digging deeper into other potential mechanisms for the flip, begin tweaking how we monitor the low velocity zone of Earth, and begin to include those alerts in our app notifications if we are ever so unfortunate as to need them in the future. The basic point today is this. Of all the works to classify, they classified the only one that could not be umbrella debunked by looking over long periods of time. Even if this was a CIA operative report, which would explain the initial classification, it has still been sanitized with pages missing and random inserts in the document that may or may not be supposed to be there. The only reason that the cyclical catastrophe is not a prominent part of modern understanding is that the mechanisms proffered by Velikovsky, Hapgood, and others would not stand the test of time analysis of Earth's rock alone, without additionally accounting for the repetition of the pole position. It should be known that in the 60s, we did not yet know about the geographic poles and their holding of long-term time average stability, and it was not part of the reason for the theory. The theory came before the awareness geophysically. Our analytical tracking of magnetic pole positions to the same predicted locations as in the classified work was first presented to you all in January of 2016, 11 months before this document was released to the public. To be clear, there is no definitive statement that can be made on the validity of the hypothesis in the declassified work. We cannot say anything about its original reason for classification, what things have been sanitized, or why they are not fit for distribution. What we can tell you definitively is that the evidence of this catastrophe is everywhere and convincing and spans fields from mythology to geophysics. The one version of the story that is rife with patterned chaos and fits the description used to debunk the others is the one they classified. These catastrophes are well preserved in rock and in story, and we are supposedly a few thousand years past the last cycle catastrophe. We could have a few thousand years left, or we might not. More coming here on our website and on the Suspect Sky YouTube channel over the coming weeks. Eyes open, no fear. Be safe, everyone.